everyone, and welcome to Season 3 of ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. If you're listening to this episode on launch day, happy Earth Day. In the spirit of Earth Day, today's episode is focused on strategies for sustainable clinical trials. I'm joined by Clare Campbell-Cooper, Global Head of Digital Health and Innovation at Fortrea, and Michael Cohen, Senior Director, Lead of Environmental Sustainability at the PPD Clinical Research Business of Thermo Fisher Scientific. I had a great conversation with Clare and Michael that ranged from a number of industry initiatives and collaborations aimed at making clinical trials more sustainable, as well as some strategies their respective companies are undertaking to improve the footprint of clinical trials on our planet. I hope you enjoy, and happy Earth Day once again. I'm very lucky to be joined by Clare and Michael today to talk about the importance of environmental sustainability in clinical research. Thank you both so much for joining me. But Michael, maybe we'll start with you and get into some collaborations in the industry. There was a recent open letter from the Sustainable Markets Initiative that was signed by 7 pharma companies addressed to CROs focused on making the healthcare supply chain more environmentally sustainable and transparent. What impact do you hope that this letter and other efforts like it will have on promoting innovation and sustainability?
Thank you, Sophia, for the question. I think this really is a great opportunity to highlight the importance of environmental sustainability in terms of both kind of heightened awareness, but also increased transparency through that data that comes from using tools like the industry low carbon clinical trials group calculator. And I think the key thing is using the insights from that calculator and that gained knowledge to then help focus in on key areas to decarbonize where really meaningful CO2 reductions can be realized. My hope, I think, for that letter, for all of our kind of cross-industry collaboration is that it really moves us forward from a period of kind of talking about the problems, talking about the issues, talking about the lack of data, setting goals, building these models into an era of innovation, an era of decarbonizing clinical trials. Many of us have set goals for 2030, obviously for 2050 that are in line with Paris agreements. And we're getting to the point where clinical trials are going to be running into that 2030 time point, right? If you start a trial now and it's a 3-year study, it's a 4-year study, there's an open label extension, we're starting to get into 2030, right? And so I think it's key for us now to start that decarbonization process in clinical trials. I know within Thermo Fisher Scientific, we've made a lot of significant investments, specifically in data capabilities, to be able to measure and understand the sources of emissions, and we'll continue to invest in that area. But I think now it's the time to look forward to accelerating those innovations to decarbonize. And some of the examples that we have, and I'm sure, Claire, you have more as well, we're offering sustainable aviation fuel as an example for air shipping for clinical trials. We're transitioning labs and clinical trial sites away from fossil fuels and really accelerating the adoption of renewable energy and renewable electricity, and really overall just need to optimize our activities, right? Reduce waste, reduce unnecessary activities, because all of those things have a CO2 footprint. And so it's key for us really to streamline things and optimize our activities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that letter is a perfect example of the fact that improving environmental sustainability in the industry is one of those areas that requires transparency, collaboration. I think exactly what you hit on there. Claire, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Fortrea's announcement from earlier this year that it would begin sponsoring the SCRS Collaborate Forward Working Group. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the goals of that partnership?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sophia. So yeah, we're partnering with SCRS to bring Collaborate forward as a new initiative. And I think this is really a good place for us to work with our sites. We're sort of changing with the sustainability focus to make sure that clinical trials have all the interested participants have a seat at the table. And this is a really good way of doing this. So Collaborate Forward's very much to start off with focusing on how we can make study startup efficient with our sites. And when you look at E6R3, the sites have a much greater seat at the table. So we need to talk to them about how they want to start studies. And to what Michael was saying about eliminating waste and making things more efficient, that's a really good way of being able to listen to what the sites say and being able for us to work with our sponsor companies to make processes efficient. And by doing that, we would increase that sustainability by minimizing the waste that we have within clinical research. And more importantly, encouraging sites to have a voice and not having studies being done to them, actually talking to them about how we can make things more efficient for them as well.
Yeah, and Claire, I want to stick with you for a second, and then Michael, I'll have you jump in here. But if we think about the environmental impact of the trials themselves, what role can things like, decentralized elements of clinical trials or a variety of technology approaches play in making research more sustainable?
Well, it's an interesting question. I was at a conference, I think it was a couple of years ago now, and we were talking about decentralization and digital health technologies as the be all and end all and the answer to everything sustainable. And realistically, someone challenged us on that at the conference, that was the trigger for me getting really interested in the sustainability movement. And that was especially within clinical research. And that was very much focused on, well, we can do a decentralized process and use technology within clinical research, but where's that inflection point of actually increasing the use of technology and then using power and batteries? And if you actually think about it, when patients are at home, the solutions that you put in place might actually mean that you are providing a mobile nurse with one set of equipment and you're actually utilizing more resources. So I think where we've got to look at for sustainability within clinical research is how do we design the clinical trials to make them more efficient, more productive, lessen the amount of data that we need to get the same response and the same results. And when you do that, you can then look at how you can decentralize elements responsibly to minimize the impact on the clinical supply chain. And I'm sure, Michael, you've got loads of comments on that as well.
No, you're right. And I think obviously those of you who know me, coming from CVS, running clinical trials in the community, it's definitely a key part of what we try to do, right, within clinical trials in terms of engaging with our patients, where they're located, where they live. We're part of the Bestoy Alliance as an example within our kind of clinical trial sustainability efforts. And the Bestoy Alliance is really going to start zeroing in on this question in terms of how do we support the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition. And it's going to be called the Digital Action Group to really focus in on this question. I think ostensibly these tools really can drastically reduce our emissions. But to your point, we need to be careful in terms of how we do them and who we're engaging with and the vendors and where that electricity, for example, is coming from. We're a big fan of opportunities of reducing on-site patient visits from a CO2 perspective, but obviously that needs to come without negatively impacting study findings, results, patient safety, et cetera. Obviously, if we can move those sites closer to the patient's homes, working with community-based locations, that can also reduce your carbon footprint, right, for that patient travel. And then the literature on control arms, right, using digital twins and things of that nature is a huge opportunity to reduce CO2, right? If you can cut your study in half, you're going to cut your emissions in half if you can go from 200 patients to 100 patients, obviously. So I think those kinds of tools within kind of digital trials and DCT can be really impactful. But, to your point, we also have to be careful and make sure we're not adding tons of technology usage and tons of additional trips and travel, et cetera. So, anything we can do that I'd say reduces the patient burden typically will also reduce the planetary burden.
If I can add to that as well, that's a really good point. One of the things I feel is really important with sustainability is actually looking at the larger impact as well. So I do think within sustainable clinical trials, we have a real role of increasing tech equity within the arena as well. That's one of the things that the UN are concentrating on, and understanding where we can help grow people's understanding of tech so that we have a greater global tech equity. I think that's a really important place that we can help contribute by using technology responsibly within our research as well.
And I think it's great to see the Googles and the AWSs and the Microsofts of the world really investing heavily in clean energy generation, right? I mean, we see it. We have a huge lab in Richmond where a lot of these data centers are located, and the renewable energy demands are skyrocketing because of these data centers. And I think that's a really key part of this point, right? Is we continue to increase the amount of data that is acquired during clinical trials. That data all has to be stored somewhere. Those data centers are massively air conditioned and cooled. The requirements from an energy and electricity perspective is massive compared to our clinical trial sites, to houses, et cetera. So I think that evolution, moving data centers to renewable energy generation, is going to be key for us as well. And that's one of those things where we as an industry will really benefit from greening of the grid, greening of transportation, greening of the shipping sector, et cetera, which is important for us to monitor as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've both sort of talked about, this idea that I think is very true in a lot of aspects of clinical research, where there's no one size fits all fix for this. Something is good in one area, but there are still challenges. So, Michael, can you talk to us a bit more about the impacts of logistics on the environment, that whole shipping conversation, just around any promising advancements maybe you're seeing towards making the shipping piece more sustainable?
Sure. Yeah, in shipping is an area in our data we've seen, both in the literature and our data, it's an important origin of emissions within clinical trial activity as well as lab activity, right? And within the Thermo Fisher business, if you think about outside of clinical trials, we have a lot of options when you think about shipping, right? We can do what's called mode shifting. We can move shipping to ocean, to ground, et cetera. Clinical trials, typically, we don't have that flexibility, right? Most things are air-shipped in clinical trials due to time sensitivity, due to patients coming in on Thursday, we need the kit there by Wednesday, those types of logistics. And so because of the air shipping requirements and the obvious CO2 emissions as a result of that, it's really important that we identify and work with our shipping partners to identify more sustainable options, both in air shipping, but also last mile. And we've announced, as an example, a partnership with DHL Express. We're using sustainable aviation fuel. It's a drop-in fuel, basically a biofuel that can be used in existing planes, and that reduces emissions by about 80% on the air shipping component. But of course, we also need to consider last mile, EV shipping for the last mile, and ground transportation from those air hubs. There's also a lot we can do when we're working with our lab partners to optimize routes, optimize locations. Because again, you think about where are you shipping things for a central lab? How can we optimize those kind of routes is important as well. And then of course we're monitoring the development of technology, hydrogen airplanes, electric airplanes, those types of things, which are certainly further afield, 2030 plus for sure, but those are the types of innovations that, again, will help us within clinical trials to continue to reduce our own emissions.
One thing I'd add to that as well is when we're operationalizing clinical trials, all of this stuff is absolutely fantastic. From our point of view, when you're looking at the clinical teams that are working on studies as well, we need to make sure that the processes we use within the clinical trials are efficient as well. So I'll give you an example. I was talking to an investigator who was saying that the patient was actually living several kilometers away from the study site, but they were having a direct-to-patient shipment as one of their home-based options for the study. But to raise that shipment, considering the patient, I think, will live within 10 kilometers from the site, the request went to somewhere in Europe that went over to the US, to then got triggered again in the UK, which then triggered something in the local depot in Eastern Europe. And then there was a van that was sent 600 kilometers, I think it was, to the patient's home. And the investigator was saying he could have walked there in half an hour, and it was just like, so what are we actually doing? So we can look at all of these different options, but unless we actually unpack the process that we put in place and challenge how we're actually operationalizing studies, we're not going to see that difference. And I think it's up to all of us to really think about how we are operationalizing studies and looking at the process. And part of really looking at sustainable clinical trials is challenging what we've always done. and what we think we should be doing, because that's what we're going to be auditing against and what we've got to answer questions about. So that's what I think we need to be going with, really looking at how we process. We're very process orientated within this industry as well.
The other thing I think that we've sort of maybe beaten around the bush a little bit is waste, right? And you think about all the packaging that comes with IP, with kits, with samples. And, I think unlike maybe consumer products where packaging is certainly a huge part of their emissions and part of their waste, which I would argue is probably a little bit easier to address. Of course, when we're talking about IP, we're talking about, the things that are touching a patient. Cleanliness and safety is obviously very, very important. So that's where I think how we look at waste at our labs, even at our clinical trial sites, is really key. And trying to identify and work with vendors that can recycle styrofoam, that can recycle pipette tips, that can do things better than just putting this stuff in a landfill, I think is also really key. I feel like we don't like to think about trash and landfill. It's this term away, right? You throw it away and it goes away and it never appears again. Has been really, I think, damaging, in society writ large, but within clinical trials as well. I think the packaging piles up, and you've probably seen it at sites and labs, the styrofoam, the boxes, everything else. So I think the ability to recycle some of those things, reuse some of those things, is also really key. I'm down in Florida. It's very flat here. And so if you see a hill, I asked my daughter this question the other day. We saw a hill, and I said, "What do you think that hill is?" And she said, "Well, it's a mountain, or it's a hill." Well, how did that get there? Have you seen any other hills in Florida? It's a landfill, right? And because of that, it's so visible. It sticks out very, very clearly, right? It's not hidden away, and we see it relatively often. So I think it's good for us as people, but also as clinical trial experts, to think about what happens to all that packaging and how can we be more efficient with it. And that's where recycled packaging, reusable shippers, all of those things can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it is really interesting, because there were a couple of things. I was actually in hospital with my son probably about 6 months ago, and he was having a challenge test that was going to last for about 4 hours. And there was 6 beds in the pediatric ward, and there was 4 beds filled with all children that were having the same challenge test. And we travelled up to Bristol, which is quite away from us because we're in quite a rural area in the UK, and we'd taken the train, so we were a little bit sustainable there. But yeah, so we turned up. And we were doing this challenge test, and the nurse was going from bed to bed because obviously there was blood taken. And every time she came, she had a new pair of gloves and a new apron. And sometimes she wasn't going to another bed. And I was saying to her, "Do you have to have a new apron?" And she said, "Yes, new gloves, new apron, every single person, every single blood." And I was like, gosh, the amount of waste that we're creating then. And I think there's that inflection point again around sterility and safety and what infection risk and everything versus the need to actually do it. And I think there is a challenge part of it, but then what would be the cost if we didn't have the sterility and the safety and everything in there? So I feel like we are, in our industry, we have a massive carbon burden, but that's the same because we've got to look at how we treat patients and the care that we have to take because of making sure that we don't spread infection as well. So I think that's part of why as an industry we have such a high carbon footprint. But I think what we have to do, and I think what we're talking about now, is how we can change our processes to make ourselves more sustainable, acknowledging what we have to do to make sure that we keep ourselves safe.
Yeah, no, this is a really good back and forth, and I almost don't even want to jump in, but I do want to give you guys a chance to talk a little bit about some of the other things you're doing in your respective companies. And so, Claire, maybe I'll start with you and some of the stuff that's going on at Fortrea. I know you guys have established a steering committee focused on responsible business and environmental practices, which is chaired, little shout out for Sandy Kennedy, who's our ACRO vice chair. She's also the Fortrea Chief Quality, Regulatory Affairs, and Sustainability Officer. We love Sandy over here at ACRO, so I wanted to give this committee a shout out. And Claire, do you mind just telling us a little bit more about your work on that committee and the goals for its impact on Fortrea's operations?
Yeah, and I think it's fantastic. I think a lot of companies, or most companies, have a similar committee. And I think it's really important. So we sort of have 3 different areas we've got 5 different areas that we're working on, but 3 that I really want to pull out. So we look at how we're running sustainable clinical trials and the practices that we can change to make ourselves more sustainable. We're also holding our management team accountable for how we can make our company better and lower the carbon footprint of our company. And I think that's really important, because I think the third pillar that we're looking at is our people. And when you talk to our people, as part of our employment engagement surveys that we do on a twice yearly basis, it's really important, the whole sustainability piece for them, and looking after our planet and making sure that we are holding ourselves accountable for lower waste and all the different species that reside on the planet with us is really critical for our people. So that's part of what our committee is all about, is making sure that we incorporate better practices within our operationalization of clinical trials, looking at our overall footprint of our companies as well, and then making sure that we have really great practices for our employees.
Mm-hmm. And one effort from Fortrea that I found really interesting was the focus on ensuring that your new facilities are efficient in terms of energy use and size, while prioritizing other elements that I think are really key right now, like access to public transit. So can you dive a little bit deeper into those efforts as well?
Yeah, so we have one of our facilities in Leeds is absolutely fantastic for this. And I used to be in the old office in Leeds, actually, and you couldn't get anything more the opposite end of the spectrum. So our new facility in Leeds is very much focused on lowering the carbon footprint. So, of course, using renewable energy sources, making sure that we've got fantastic public access to transport to and from work for both the volunteers that are coming into the 100-bed unit, but also for our own staff as well. So that flexibility is there. And as Michael was saying as well, that sourcing of sustainable and renewable energy is really, really key. But not only where we get our energy from, but also how we utilize the energy within the building. So making sure that our lighting's better, how we use all the processes in, how we remove waste from the system as well. So incineration of waste, I think, has resulted in over 42% decrease in our carbon footprint. And so it's a really good way of being able to see how we can utilize a facility more sustainably. And the good thing about it is we've also reused the building. We've repurposed the building as well, which and it's helping regenerate one of the areas in Leeds as well. So it's a fantastic facility for us.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Michael, Claire mentioned renewable energy. So I wanted to touch on, I saw an announcement from the PPD clinical research business of Thermo Fisher Scientific about purchasing solar power in Spain. So can you tell us a little bit more about, how renewable energy, particularly solar and wind, can support your near-term and also long-term environmental goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think for humanity, right, electrifying everything and building up renewable energy is really our only path forward to a powered kind of modern and clean economy. And these have to occur in concert, right? We have to remove fossil fuels from our on-site heating, et cetera, our scope 1 emissions, and we have to transition to electrification that's running on renewable energy and our scope 2 emissions. And so while these don't really seem connected to clinical trials, I think it's key to remember that the spaces that we occupy, right, the hospitals, the sites, the labs, these all have lighting, they have computers, they have water and space heating, they have air conditioning, they have refrigeration. I can go on. And all of these things take electricity or use fossil fuels for heating. So I think from phase 1 clinics, like Claire mentioned, to labs and hospitals, these utilities are really a significant portion of emissions. And by electrifying and also moving to renewable energy, we can pretty easily, I'd say, reduce our emissions, specifically these are scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so Thermo Fisher Scientific, we have plans to power all of our companies, US, Canada, and addressable European sites with 100% renewable energy by 2026. So this will include many of our labs, our own clinical trial sites. And then in parallel, we also have a carbon capital plan, which is electrifying boilers, optimizing HVAC systems. We're putting in EV chargers for cars and really transitioning to an electrified system that's backed by solar and wind. And so I think between those two kind of key ideas of electrification and renewable energy, we can very, very nicely, I'd say, reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions over a time period.
Yeah, I think both of your companies are leading some really exciting efforts. So I'm, again, really glad to have had you join me today. I'm wondering if maybe we could do one final question. If you could leave sort of a final message to our listeners just about why sustainability and research is so important, or a call to action, what would that be? Claire, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so when we actually get down to the bottom line of why we're doing this and why we all work in clinical research, we're really looking to make people healthier. That's the bottom line. And when you look at why participants take part in clinical research, a lot of it is to benefit future generations that might have the same condition that they have, and they're taking part in clinical research for. So by us looking after the planet for future generations is the biggest gift that we can give to people, because we're making sure that the reason that they're taking part in clinical research is the reason why we're trying to make it better for future generations as well. So I think that's the message I'd give to people. It can be challenging to try and change every single process, but if everybody that works in clinical research tried to change one practice or process that they have, we'd be making the world a better place overall, and especially for the people that are involved in clinical research.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we just got the data in from 2024. The last 10 years have officially are the warmest 10 years on record, right? And I think that underlines the urgency of addressing climate change and understanding the power of innovation to create a better world. And so we innovate at Thermo Fisher to provide our customers with solutions to develop more environmentally sustainable clinical research. Like Claire said, environmental sustainability is hard. It will require change, but I don't want it to be viewed through the lens of just green premiums and added cost. Anthropogenic climate change is probably the biggest threat that we will face, and that's according to the UN. And to me, that means it needs to be the biggest driver of change, the driver of modernization, the driver of optimization, and the driver of efficiencies. So we need to use data to make all of our decisions better and inform those decisions. And do we need that extra MRI? Can this visit be done remotely? Can we optimize that process? These are the types of questions I think we really need to be asking ourselves within clinical trials, because all of these decisions have a CO2 price tag, and we're getting better data to be able to tell you what that price tag is. And so I think that is where we can optimize, we can do better as an industry to improve our carbon footprint. One of the things I say all the time is it's very easy to get lost in all the numbers and all the emissions, and a lot of people will say, well, China opens a new coal plant every week. What good am I going to do here, right? And I think that's sort of a failing mindset, right? Every little decision that we all make, both in our working lives and our personal lives, can make an impact, and it can add up, right? And I think Claire's point is spot on, right? Planet health and patient health are intrinsically intertwined. We probably don't have time to go over all the reasons why, but they are linked. We are here to improve healthcare, right? Improve patient health. We can't at the same time negatively impact planetary health. And so we need to do our best to improve both.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really just wanted to thank both of you for joining me today. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you. Happy Earth Month and happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed this season 3 premiere of ACRO's GCP. I wanted to thank Claire and Michael for joining me today on the podcast. It was a great conversation, and stay tuned for more episodes of GCP coming very soon.